This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 820 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I was happy with last week's Sleeper Show results. On the negative side of things, Baker Mayfield and Gardner Minshew, they were not good streamers. Kenneth Gainwell didn't exactly get the game script that I was hoping for. Dawson Knox and Logan Thomas, they weren't very good streaming options either. And some of the deeper wide receiver plays, they didn't pan out. Now, with all that being said, Sam Howell was a viable option. Brandon Cooks, Josh Downs, Robert Woods, Curtis Samuel, Savon Ahmed, and Chuba Hubbard all scored touchdowns. And none of the defensive streamers sank you either. The Vikings in particular were a really good choice. Overall, pretty decent week for a show like this. Hopefully things continue this week, because it's a really rough one with so many buys. Let's get to it. This first tier of players is rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, so they're out there in the majority of leagues. As usual, I'm going to kick things off with some quarterback options. But I have to admit that the quarterback streamers this week, they're not great, at least on paper. I'm going to start with Josh Dobbs. Dobbs gets Seattle this week, and the Seahawks have been the 8th best matchup for quarterbacks this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Dobbs hasn't been great over his last two, but at least in week 6, we saw some of that rushing juice return. He's now rushed for 40 or more yards in 4 of his last 5 games. That's essentially an extra passing touchdown in fantasy production. If we see a negative game script hit, we might get more scrambling from Josh Dobbs. And that's really what we want, because the Cardinals aren't projected for many points this week. Now there's also Derek Carr. He's another guy who works if you're in a pinch, but I'm not overly excited about him. Carr plays on Thursday night, which probably isn't a plus, and he gets a pretty average matchup against the Jags. The over-under in that game is currently set at just 39.5 points, and Trevor Lawrence isn't 100% healthy. That gives us less of a chance of a true back and forth. Even still, like I talked about in the 10 Trends episode, Carr does have some favorable regression coming his way. He's thrown about 3 fewer touchdowns this year than he should have based on his yardage total. And his 2.5% touchdown rate, that's a career low. I think he's more of a mid-range QB2 this week, but that might be good enough for you, because it's a rough week in general. Now moving on to running back, it's an absolute disaster. Honestly though, when the position is as messy as it is right now, it gives me an opportunity to pick off some potential sleepers. One guy you might be able to lean on this week is Zach Charbonnet. He's under that 50% rostered number now because people dropped him after a pretty poor performance in week 6. He saw just 9.5% of Seattle's running back rushes when he was closer to that 25-30% range during his 2 games prior. Seattle, though, wasn't in a positive game script. That's going to be big for Sharps. When the Seahawks are leading, they're going to deploy their two-headed monster more. They're going to want to use both running backs to close out games, like we saw in week 3, for example. Now they get Arizona this week. FanDuel Sportsbook has the Seahawks as a pretty big 7.5 point home favorite. Kenneth Walker is obviously the preferred choice, but Charbonnet could end up getting like 10 touches in this game. Next on the list, Jaleel McLaughlin. We saw Denver's 3-man backfield in week 6, but Samaje Perine really was just seeing pass catching snaps for the Broncos. So yes, it's a 3-headed monster, but Perine had just a 17% snap share this past week. McLaughlin was at 40%, Javonte Williams 35%. McLaughlin also had the highest route participation by far on that team. And McLaughlin's been really good this year. He has by far the best expected points added per carry among Broncos running backs. And he's the only one with a rushing yards over expected per rush that's north of 0. And it's well north of 0. He gets a Packers team this week that's been the 4th worst against running backs this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. I don't think he's a terrible flex play given the situation at running back across the league. Now, I've got to mention the San Francisco running backs here because both those guys are still under that 50% mark. Like I said on the 15 Transaction Show, I'm only leaning Jordan Mason because he played more snaps than Elijah Mitchell last week. And that's our most recent sample. Of course, though, Elijah Mitchell was coming off an injury, so anything's possible. The reason we care about this, though, is because San Francisco is one of the most efficient offenses in football, and they could see a positive game script this week against Minnesota. So realistically, both Mason and Mitchell, they could be okay. I'm projecting this to be a split backfield. Latavius Murray is seeing more work in the Bills' backfield, and Damian Harris had a scary injury this past week, so Murray's role is even more secure now. But in week 6, Murray ended up with the same snap share as James Cook. Cook still ran more routes, he saw more touches on the ground. But Murray hit a season-high 44% running back rush share. That was more than double his previous high. Buffalo gets New England, and while the Patriots have been fine against running backs this year, game script could dictate a lot of running back touches for Buffalo. And Murray's also the favorite to see goal line work. That makes him intriguing. We'll have to see what happens with Jahmyr Gibbs this week because right now, as I record this, it's not confirmed that he's going to play. If he goes, Craig Reynolds is less attractive as an option. I still think Reynolds would maybe see 7 to 10 rushes, but Gibbs would likely dominate the receiving work out of the backfield in that scenario. Now, if Gibbs does not go, it could be the Craig Reynolds show for Detroit. David Montgomery's hurt. Gibbs would be hurt in this scenario too. And even Bam Knight is hurt. He's out for the year. So Reynolds is the last healthy back on this team in this scenario where Gibbs doesn't play. It's him and Devine Ezigbo. So keep an eye on that. Because if Gibbs is out, Reynolds could be an RB2 this week. If Gibbs is in, he's more of a cross your fingers flex. Moving on, let's take a look at some wide receivers. I think a lot of people are going to look at Josh Downs' opponent this week, which is Cleveland, and be turned off. But his individual matchup, it's not that bad. Cleveland actually ranks first in percentage of targets that have been funneled to the slot this year, and they've allowed the most slot receptions in football. That's despite being the toughest opponent for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So yeah, maybe the ceiling won't be crazy for Josh Downs, but as Indy's slot man, maybe he'll still see 7 or 8 targets and pay off. Curtis Samuel's another slot guy who's been producing, and I think he makes some sense as a flex this week. I think we need to realize that he's running really hot in the touchdown department. But like I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show, he's been averaging an 18% target share per game over his last 3, and that's in a pretty pass-heavy offense. The matchup for him is average on paper this week, but as a waiver wire option, he definitely makes sense. And then one more wide receiver for you in this tier is Wan'Dale Robinson. I've got slot guys galore here. Robinson saw his best route participation of the season in week 6. He ran around on 72% of New York's dropbacks. That led to a 26% target share. Now, he doesn't get high quality down the field targets, but in PPR formats, he can be usable. That's what we saw last week with his 8-catch performance. And now he gets Washington, a team that's really struggled against wide receivers this year. They've allowed the second most adjusted fantasy points per game to the position. At tight end, Luke Musgrave gets Denver this week. The perfect matchup. The Broncos are the most advantageous matchup for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed, and Musgrave projects to see like a 17, 18% target share. That's enough for him to be a reasonable streaming option. And then there's also the 15 transactions ad in Michael Mayer. He's seen target shares of 10% and 19% over his last 2. He's coming off a tight end 1 performance. This week, he gets Chicago. The Bears have been a top 10 opponent for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Mayer's not a bad streaming choice. This next tier consists of players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues you may be able to start. So they're worse than the tier before this one, and generally speaking, I hope you don't actually have to play them. As of right now, we don't know if Daniel Jones is going to play this weekend. If we assume that he's out, I don't mind Tyrod Taylor at quarterback. Washington has been torched by passing attacks this year. Since facing Arizona in week 1, they've seen Russell Wilson capture a QB3 performance, Josh Allen QB8, Jalen Hurts QB5, Justin Fields QB1, and Desmond freaking Ritter, he was the QB10 last week. Taylor looked competent enough in a much more difficult matchup in week 6. So he could take advantage in this one. Washington's secondary has been horrible. At running back in this tier, a lot of people are understandably paying up for Zach Evans right now. I think he's the favorite to see the most touches in that backfield. But he's now rostered in over 50% of Yahoo leagues, so I can't talk about him on this show, at least as a play, as a sleeper. But I also think there's a chance that he just isn't the guy. That he hasn't earned Sean McVay's trust, or that he's not good enough. The Rams went out, they got a couple of running backs this week. largely because they just needed some depth. They needed bodies there with Ronnie Rivers and Kyron Williams being hurt. But they also have Royce Freeman. Royce Freeman is my sub 10% running back choice this week. The Rams have a plus matchup against a bad Pittsburgh defense, and Freeman's the only non-Evans running back who's been on that roster for more than just a few days. So if there's a split backfield, which is possible, or if they don't trust Evans that much, that's also possible, then Royce Freeman could see more work than people expect. And not only that, but he's probably a more capable goal line back too. Now at wide receiver, I think you could look at multiple New York Giants pass catchers. Darius Slayton, that's probably the safer choice here. But I'm kind of intrigued by Jalen Hyatt. This is the second time this year that I'm talking up Hyatt. The last time I did it, it amounted to absolutely nothing. So be aware of that. Take this with a grain of salt. But like I said, Washington's secondary has been torched this year. They're the second best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And Jalen Hyatt saw 77% route participation last week. That was a season high. He also had a 13% target share, also a season high. I think he has some sneaky appeal. And as we know, he's someone who's capable of making some big plays. And then another wideout in this group, Rondale Moore. This is more of a high floor option compared to Jalen Hyatt. But Moore has seen target shares of 29%, 5%, 17%, and 18% over his last 4 games. He's hit 5 targets in 3 of those contests. The Cardinals could have a pass-heavy script against Seattle. And the Seahawks haven't been great against wide receivers this year. In fact, they've been the 3rd best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Moore makes some sense. And then lastly, at tight end, you could look at Taysom Hill. He was actually used as a pass catcher last week. He had 8 targets. He caught 7 of them for 49 yards. Those targets are pretty much all low average depth of target throws. But that's an intriguing number for any tight end streamer. I think there's obvious risk here because that's not how they use Taysom Hill week in and week out. But it's a short week. That might mean that they don't dramatically change up their game plan for this Thursday night game. So I think he's a tight end 2 this week and one of the go-tos in this percent rostered range. As for streaming defenses, there's a lot of them this week. I'll quickly run through them. Washington gets a big advantage defensively at the line this week. They're 12th in pressure rate defensively, and the Giants are 31st in pressure rate allowed. So I think Washington's a very good option. Seattle as a big favorite against Arizona. They make plenty of sense. Tampa Bay is the one that I talked about in the 15 transaction show. The Rams get the Steelers, who've struggled offensively and rank as a top half matchup for fantasy defenses. And then Green Bay against Denver. That's not a terrible play. And also, don't sleep on Indianapolis against Cleveland, especially if Deshaun Watson is not back this week. But I think Washington, Seattle, Tampa Bay, those 3 make the most sense this week. And I've bought more into Washington as the week's gone on. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I've got a mailbag show and a Late Round Perspectives episode dropping tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.